The revival of feminism. In 1960, the election of John F. Kennedy signaled a new and more public phase for feminists who had been advocating to improve women's status in the labor force for 2 decades. At the time, there were no battered women's shelters, abortion was illegal, want ads in the newspaper were divided into men's and women's jobs, and the words sexism and miss had not been coined. Not a single university offered a course in women's studies, and women's sports programs were small and underfunded. Over the next 15 years, the landscape shifted dramatically. By the end of the decade, the women's issues and feminism seemed to be everywhere, challenging the unequal treatment that women received as citizens and members of families and leading to fundamental social change in the nation's laws, institutions, and culture. Once sexism had been identified, there was no going back. Even when the feminist movement slowed in the 1980s and 90s, social movements did not spring up when leaders announced a set of demands. Preconditions for the revival of feminism lay in the changing social and demographic bases of women's lives, especially increased labor force participation, greater access to higher education, a declining birth rate, and changing patterns of marriage. Probably the most important factor was the dramatic rise in women working in the post-war years, which undercut traditional gender expectations that women's primary roles were domestic. To be female in America now usually included education and often a career, as well as marriage and possibly a single parenthood after a divorce. These changing social realities created a major constituency for the revival of feminism in the 1960s and 70s. Two distinct strands fueled the explosion of interest and energy associated with the revival of feminism on the national level. The first was the women's right branch of the movement, best exemplified by the President's Commission on the Status of Women, led by Esther Peterson, a veteran union activist and Assistant Secretary of Labor, and the founding of the National Organization for Women in 1966. Women's rights activists, who were primarily older elite professional women and full-time volunteers, focused on breaking down artificial barriers to women's advancement, especially through legislation such as the Equal Pay Act of 1963, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. Taking a cue from the original Manifesto of Now, they believed it was time to take action to bring women into full participation in the mainstream of American society now, exercising all the privileges and responsibilities thereof in truly equal partnership with men. Younger, more militant women came to feminism through the civil rights and anti-war movements to form a totally new women's liberation branch of feminism. The self-confidence and organization skills they learned in those movements ran headlong into sexist expectations that they would automatically take notes or serve coffee while men monopolized the leadership roles. Gradually, and often reluctantly, women realized they needed their own movement. Often in or just out of college, these activists did not want to join now's mainstream. They wanted to tear the system down, replacing it with non-racist, non-sexist institutions. A symbol of both their humor and their seriousness was the decision to protest the Miss America pageant in 1968. Much of the energy of women's liberation, or women's lib, came from its embrace of consciousness-raising groups where participants came together to share personal stories of their lived experience as women. They inevitably experienced the click movement when they realized that other women shared feelings and their personal frustrations were not just the result of an individual failure or to adjust to social cultural norms, but of their secondary status in a male-defined social hierarchy. Brandishing outrage and impassioned rhetoric to make their point, radical women in small groups such as the Red Stockings, the Women's Liberation Union, and bread and roses attacked what they saw as a patriarchal, oppressive society that demeaned and devalued women. In the 1960s, these two branches, the more mainstream women's rights movement and the more radical women's liberation movement, were fairly small and often quite separate. A career administrator at the Women's Bureau was not likely to be on the Atlantic City boardwalk throwing her bra into a Freedom trash can, nor was a Miss America protester likely to be testifying before Congress on equal pay legislation. But after 1970, the distinctions between women's rights and women's liberation blurred as a rush of new converts flooded the cause. One very public manifestation was the rallies and marches held around the country on August 26, 1970, in honor of the 50th anniversary of winning the vote, as several thousands of women took to the streets proclaiming their allegiance to the exciting new ideas of modern feminism. All right, so where is the stop recording?